In attempting to tell the story of Egg Harbor, it was necessary to use histories of other authors as well as recollections of local people who lived much of the story. Contradictions did surface, probably because different persons heard different renditions of how, where, and when something came to be. However, for the most part, the following story will be quite accurate. I would like to thank those people who were so generous with information and pictures in the preparation of this story. Most specifically, I'm grateful to Ed Cabot, Esther Bernstein, Seal Leroy, plus many others. I am grateful to my daughters, Christy and Cindy, who helped me enormously in preparing the slides. But especially do I wish to thank Miriam Erickson, without whose assistance this presentation would not have been possible. The Egg Harbor story. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth to include a setting with a picturesque harbor surrounded by bluffs and densely wooded, situated on a long peninsula. Isn't this where the story really begins? Thousands of years ago, that peninsula went through a major transition. Known as the Niagara Cuesta, a strata of earth from Niagara Falls all across the northern part of the Great Lakes, down along the eastern shore of Wisconsin, tipped down on one edge and up on the other, forming Door County. Later came a glacier, carving out the hollows and stripping the soil, only later to melt and recede, depositing water and earth and debris foreign to this peninsula. As time moved on, this picturesque harbor and this peninsula became inhabited. It was the Indian who first recognized the quality of the area, what with the abundance of fish and game. Not only did the Winnebago roam this land, a tribe known for their passion for warfare, so also did the Potawatomi and Sacs inhabit the region. The first sign of civilized man occurred in 1634 when Jean Nicolet touched shore at Rock Island, Nicolet Bay, and Red Banks. The county, beginning at Washington Island, formed part of a route from Quebec to what the early explorers hoped would be China or India. That not happening, it did open a route via Prairie du Chien to St. Louis and New Orleans. Simultaneously, it became a fur trading route between southern Wisconsin and Mackinac, which by then was in direct trade with Montreal and Quebec. From there, the furs were shipped to Europe. To put things in perspective, let us recall these dates. 1755, not yet Door County, our peninsula was known as Long Point. 1761, where explorers had been French, they were now British. 1836, the entire area was known as the Wisconsin Territory. 1848, Wisconsin was granted statehood. 1851, the peninsula was awarded the name Door County, a derivative of Porty Moore, Death's Door. 1861, on July 9th of this year, Egg Harbor was formed. The first knowledge of a white man in Egg Harbor came in 1680. Tonty, who had traveled with Father Marquette and LaSalle, came ashore at Horseshoe Bay because of a leaky canoe. Their mission, they had hoped, was to add a new province to France. Because winter had set in, the group tried to reach an abandoned Indian village near Sturgeon Bay, but ice prevented them from reaching their destination. It was the Indians who put them up for the winter. There is a 150-year void in history at this point. Our next revelation is that of Increase Claflin. Recognized as the first white settler in Door County, he was born in New York in 1795, his dad having been a Minuteman at Lexington in the Revolutionary War. Increase was chasing Indians in southeastern Wisconsin during the Black Hawk War of 1822, then moving his family to Little Sturgeon in 1835. He moved to Fish Creek in 1844 because of a strained relationship with the Indians at Squaw Point. During a trip, while coasting along the shore, he took shelter here. In so doing, he found a nest of duck eggs, thereby giving Egg Harbor its name. Another version recorded by Henry S. Baird, lawyer, involved a trip he and his wife took aboard a flotilla en route from Green Bay to Mackinac. Joseph Roulette, fur trader, was in charge, piloting the lead boat. His able assistant, Mr. Kinsey, was in command of the second boat. As they passed our shores on a pleasant June day, it was decided to go ashore for lunch. In fun, the boats started racing. As the pursuing boat came alongside the lead boat, the lunch baskets were opened and a volley of eggs were exchanged. Apparently it was quite a display, requiring a cleanup project after they got ashore. Hence, the sham battle of how Egg Harbor received its name. The first white settler of Egg Harbor was Milton E. Lyman, an educated, popular, and companionable man. Dreaded for his wit and sarcasm, with stories ranging from consort of pettifoggers, that being a trickster of the law, to the honor of being the first county judge in Door County. Historians have suggested that he settled in the same approximate location as where the egg fight took place, but this is not necessarily true. Courthouse records indicate that Mr. Lyman was granted a land patent in 1862 for the property now occupied as a condominium across from the golf course. On August 3, 1861, Milton Lyman became Egg Harbor's first postmaster. An interesting letter written by Jacob E. Thorpe in 1880 to Charles Martin, who wrote a book called The Expositor, A History of Door County, has some interesting reading. Jacob claimed he was the first white settler in Door County, yet historians say he was the second settler. He was married to Mary Claflin, a daughter of Increase Claflin. Excerpts of the letter as follows. During the first few years of Increase Claflin's stay at Little Sturgeon, the Menominee and Chippewa Indians were quite troublesome. At one time, they surrounded his house and threatened to kill him and his family, but no harm was done to anyone except his son-in-law, Robert Stevenson, who while fighting with them was stabbed twice. They attempted to drag Mrs. Stevenson, Increase's daughter, from the house, but were defeated in the attempt. In 1850, I came to Fish Creek, where I worked at the Cooper trade until 1855, when I came to Egg Harbor. In the fall of 1855, my brother, Levi Thorpe, came to Egg Harbor, and he and I put in the first pier at that place where we shipped wood. Winters, I teamed on the ice from Green Bay to Death's Door, trading with the settlers. I did my teaming on the ice because there were no roads in the peninsula. Many a cold and stormy night I have spent on the ice, lost in a snowstorm. The only way to save the life of myself and team was to travel around all night without any refreshments for myself or team. In 1857, I sold my share in the dock to my brother Levi. In 1862, I built a large hotel at Egg Harbor and carried on hotel keeping until 1867, when my house burned and I moved to Fish Creek." Unquote. Oliver Graham, who came to Door County in 1861, and whose name is the first to appear in an Egg Harbor treasurer's ledger, on August 6, 1870, also wrote Mr. Martin, and I quote, "The steamer Michigan made an attempt late in the fall of 1854 to get into Sturgeon Bay with supplies for Bradley and Crandall, but had to back out and land the supplies at Allen's Dock, Egg Harbor." And that's the end of quote. It was Andrew Anderson who first pioneered the Horseshoe Bay area, building the first pier in 1870, buying and shipping cordwood. A thriving community, this intersection of the current highways B and G once contained a general store, cooper shop, saloon, sawmill, blacksmith shop, and farther up the road a schoolhouse. The Maple brothers had an extensive fishing operation just north of the present pier. The homes by and large were log homes. Since timber was plentiful, they were generally constructed by the owner. A typical long home would measure 12 by 12 feet with probably one small window for light and ventilation, no screens, and of course a doorway. The Walzine cabin was located 1/2 mile east of Carlsville. And the Hanrahan cabin was located alongside the present Highway 42, 1/4 mile south of Town Line Road. You might find this interesting. Carlsville got its name from all the settlers who had the first name of Carl. There was Carl Walzine, Carl Krieger, Carl Schuster, Carl Crowell, and Carl Schultz. Since most of the Carls started with a K, they settled on Carlsville with a C, since they thought it was more American. Fish were always salted to preserve them. Ed Cabot told me that he, his sister, and his brother would salt fish for the Maples for 5 cents per 100 pounds. On one occasion, they salted 4,500 packages of fish, made $45, and then gave the money to their dad so he could buy a cow. A large cordwood holding area was situated below our village. Teamsters would use the road across from the cupola house, known as Levine's Hill, for getting to the dock. The hill had a holdback, which was an anchor and a ring buried in the road to fasten their sleighs to, preventing the sleighs and teams from descending too fast. Some interesting tidbits. The fish house located next to the dock was taken down about 1907. Many of the settlers used Belgians and Indians in the making of cordwood. The men received 50 cents per cord for chopping wood. Wood was frequently sold for $2 per cord. Sturgeon, considered junk fish, were so numerous the fishermen would get them entwined in their nets and would pile them up along the shore like cordwood to rot. Carrier pigeons were so plentiful you could knock them out of the air with a pole. Settlers would throw a net over them when they landed on the ground and have enough food for a month. All good things come to an end, as today the carrier pigeon is extinct. Enter Levi Thorpe. His father was Jacob Thorpe, and his younger brother was Asa of Fish Creek. In 1849, Levi sailed out of New York, around the Horn, joining the California Gold Rush. He returned to Door County in 1855 with $5,000 in gold dust, bringing along a Chinese companion helper who had been with him on the East Coast. Levi bought up most of the property on which Egg Harbor Village now stands. His holdings total 1,600 acres, even including the land where the Carlsville Schoolhouse, presently the Door County Winery, was built. As a matter of fact, he sold the school site in 1869 and then loaned the district $430.85 toward construction of the schoolhouse. The land grant that Levi received was in the form of a patent dated 1858 and signed by President Buchanan. Levi had a dream, which one was to take much of the money he had so carefully saved. He wanted to build an outstanding home in Door County, overlooking the bay. During the 16 years prior to building this house, he made plans and gathered materials. He lived in a log cabin just below the hill. In 1871, the cupola house was completed, and what a beauty she was. A 14-room mansion, probably painted dark gray-green at first, made from the finest lumber available. It is said that not a single board was accepted if it contained a knot. Mrs. Thorpe had a paper hanger come from Milwaukee to paper the halls. The house had a ballroom, sitting room, milk house, a servants section. Fred Berger's mother, Nellie Lyman, worked for the Thorpes, and perhaps the most outstanding feature, a widow's walk. Located on top of the house, Mr. Thorpe would use it to watch his farm and observe vessels at his dock. Levi occupied his home until 1906. He was buried in the Egg Harbor Cemetery in 1918, having attained 94 years of age. He is buried next to his wife in an unmarked grave. Located about where the present road leads to the Egg Harbor treatment plant, just south of the cemetery, stood the Lyman Morey farm. He was a veteran of the Civil War, which was fought from April 1861 to April 1865. Mr. Morey settled in Egg Harbor in 1864. His buildings comprised a root house, barns, granary, log cabin home with a post office attached on the north side, and of course an outhouse. This was Egg Harbor's fourth post office. He was appointed April 29th, 1874. At this point in time, Egg Harbor consisted of the Jack Manny Farm, located where Highway 42 and County E intersect, Jerry Lemire Sr.'s Saloon, currently Casey's, the Cupola House, the Thorpe House across the street from the Cupola House, Captain Bill Levine's on the ledge between the highway and the water, just below the cupola house. The Jack Behringer home, built in 1876. Jack was a merchant, pier owner. The home was later owned by Claude Gard and run as a post office. Later became Jerry Lemire's home, barber shop, post office, and is owned today by Harvey Hain. And the Joe Bruning farm. All that is left today is the silo, standing just east of the Main Street Market. Just a little about Jerry Lemire. Before building the saloon, he lived on a farm a mile east of Highway 42 on County E. He moved in 1870. The original owner, who received the land patent in 1860, was a Southern colonel. But because of the Civil War, the Attorney General took title in 1862, reselling it in 1865. Jerry Lemire Jr. and George Lemire were born on this farm. Jerry Sr. would board horses for the Indians in his barn. Then came the LaPlante House, built by Antoine LaPlante, father of past realtor Earl Mitchell LaPlante. Antoine came from Canada, farmed, had a trading vessel, and then built a saloon hotel in 1879 on property originally purchased by Levi Thorpe. It was owned by Levi Baraboo in 1889, but burned down shortly afterward with only $700 insurance on the building. It was rebuilt shortly after as the Concord Hotel. Cost of construction, $1,500. The Concord served as the station for the stage, with a waiting room adjacent to the saloon. The barn and back stable the spare team when the driver pulled in from Sturgeon Bay, continuing on to northern part of the county. You know today as Old Stage Station. Charles LaRouche, who came from Bay St. Paul, north of Quebec, with Eugene Gagnon in 1884, owned and operated the General Merchant Store, now a gift shop across from the Main Street Market. Eugene Gagnon, incidentally, was the father of Ed, grandfather of Gene Chase. Charles LaRouche turned the business over to his son Leo and built a home next to the town hall, which Leo LaFountain bought at a later date. Leo had a sugar bush just above the swale north of South Trail. Important in the history of Egg Harbor is Horace Doc Ames. Born in Quebec in 1859, he came to Egg Harbor with his parents in 1876. He married Russell Baker's daughter, she being a former student of his, as he was a teacher and, interestingly, a relative of Buffalo Bill. Doc went to school at Valparaiso University, returning to Egg Harbor to become a physician, surgeon, druggist. His house and office later became a lumber yard and feed mill after he moved to the large home and fruit farm 1/2 mile east of the village in County E. Dr. Ames subdivided much of the property that Levi Thorpe once owned and operated the dock, presently the village marina, for the Goodrich steamers. Joe Bruning, part-time cobbler, built his farm about 1880 on what is now the present grocery. Ben Sauger married Sophia Bruning about 1887 and ran the farm for several years. Later, Leo LaFountain used the farm buildings and the Bruning house was rented out. Currently, all the buildings have been torn down. Early Egg Harbor had a cooper shop where barrels were made. It was located on the west side of the hill, going north. Jerry Lemire had a tavern which housed his brother George's barber shop with a dance hall upstairs. South on G was the schoolhouse. Note, not all agree about the cooper shop. From a plat map dated 1899, we can identify Leroy's Pier, straight in off Mariner Road, and Levi Thorpe's Pier, straight down from the cupola house. In addition, we learn of Frank Welliver, town chairman, married William Leroy's daughter Sarah, D.D. Donovan, teacher, Cap Kirtland, and others. About Cap Kirtland. He moved here in 1863 and built a home on the hill above the bathing beach. The beginning of Hillside Trail was named Kirtland's Hill. He had a dock adjacent to the beach. Later, his farm was taken over by Dr. Schrader from Marinette. Wallace Utter was the manager. The bridge entering Egg Harbor from the south spanned a brook. Since the Morey farm was across the road, it became known as Morey's Brook. I am told the Maori children used to play with the Indian children in this area. I would guess the beauty of our area was just as popular in our early history as it is today. Sidelight. The year now is about 1890. In Horseshoe Bay, an ice company made up of Sturgeon Bay people was organized, employing about 60 men. It folded after a very short career, which spelled the demise of Horseshoe Bay as a thriving community. As time passed, the cupola house changed. The once gray-green exterior was replaced by a coat of white paint. In 1906, the house was sold by Levi Thorpe to his son-in-law, C.A. Speaker. Speaker turned the Thorpe homestead into a hotel and stagecoach shop. Shortly prior to Levi Thorpe's leaving, his son Truman Thorpe lived across the street and operated a general store. The store was opened about 1879 and was an agent for the Goodrich Transportation Company. Unfortunately, the store operation was unsuccessful and, quote, lost his father a great deal of money, unquote. Truman was postmaster for part of this time. In 1911, the store burned down, and there were some rumors as to cause of the fire. About this time, Philip Lemire lived just north of his brother's tavern. He had a fish house on the shore about 3/4 mile north of the village marina. Old-timers tell me you could buy a bucket of fish for 25 cents. Tragedy struck in 1903. As the headlines in the newspaper announced, the steamer Hackley, owned by the Fish Creek Transportation Company, sunk, taking 11 lives. The Hackley had been built in 1882, was 79 feet long, and had a 17-foot beam. She had left Menominee, Michigan at 5 p.m. in the evening with 12 passengers and a crew of 5. The Hackley pulled out in threatening weather, headed for Fish Creek. Captain Joe Voris was the pilot, and Carl Pelkey was the cook. Of the 11 that drowned, Edna and Ethel Vincent were the only passengers from Egg Harbor. They had lived in the house across from the original stone Evangelical, now Methodist Church. The steamer Sheboygan of the Goodrich Line picked up the 8 survivors. There had been another sinking in 1870 when the schooner Carrington went down at Hat Island, but fortunately no lives were lost. At this point in time, there were 5 school districts in the town of Egg Harbor. Started as one-room schoolhouses, there was one in the village, which was built in 1895, a school in Horseshoe Bay, located below the bluff just opposite Mariner Road, Carlsville, Sunny Point, and a school called Pleasant on School Road behind the John, now Ray Beekner Farm, just east of Heritage Mobile Park. Maloney and Jacob Verts were early settlers, coming to Egg Harbor about 1865. They lived on top of the bluff up Kirtland's Hill. I was told that when the young fellows would come downtown with their pa, they would hoot on their way past the schoolhouse. An interesting note, Elsie Wood was the teacher. Farms were small, but they made a living. Methods were crude, and thrashing always meant a big crew. Gus Tank was one of our early rural carriers. He had come to Egg Harbor in 1890. In 1904, mail was being delivered by buggy. Incidentally, Gus was assessor for the town of Egg Harbor for many years. His son John followed in his father's footsteps. The first Catholic church in Egg Harbor was a log building adjacent to the present Catholic cemetery, a mile south of the village on Highway 42. It was built in 1878. In 1888, the church was moved across the road just north of the original location. In 1909, the present church was built in the village, at which point the old church was abandoned. The old church was later moved into the village and then became part of LaRouche's grocery store. Although the new Catholic church was built in 1909, the bell tower was not added until the following year, 1910. The Sailor Boy plied these waters at that time, connecting Sturgeon Bay, Green Bay, Marinette, Menominee, and all the villages on the west shore of northern Door County. When landing in Egg Harbor, she would tie up at Ames's dock, with the fish house on the shore and the Warcheck fanning mill on the pier. When in Sturgeon Bay, you could board her at the Kallenbach dock. The sailor boy would leave for Green Bay early in the day and return to Sturgeon Bay at night. About 1908, Levi Baraboo built the stone house, which was torn down in 1982. By this time, his son Theodore was running the Concord Hotel. Some years later, when Levi died, his son Albert moved into the house and farmed the acreage. William Manny came to Egg Harbor from Pennsylvania in 1857. Also known as Jack, he received a land patent for a farm just north of County E, where the Methodist Church now stands. He had been a bound boy, that's an indentured servant, in Pennsylvania, but was quite well educated. When he moved to Egg Harbor, there were few white settlers, the area being inhabited mostly by Indians. He was considered the community doctor, veterinarian, lawyer, and counselor. It is said that in building his home, he copied the interior of the cupola house room for room, but on a smaller scale. Jim Wilson, born in Jacksonport, had been a grocer in Sturgeon Bay, ran the Truman Thorpe store for many years, and boarded at the Manny house. The Mannies took a liking to Jim and told their daughter Rose to come home from Escanaba, where she was working, and meet the nice young man. They were married, then building a grocery store in 1910 downtown on the site presently known as Harborview Park. You could purchase, among other things, salted herring from a keg, kerosene, and toys at Christmas. When things were not too busy in the store, time was used to saw wood for heating. Typical crew might be made up of Albert Shields, brother to Jack and Jerry Lemire Sr., Fred Schrader, son of August and father of Roger, who was in the insurance business in Sturgeon Bay, and of course Jim Wilson himself. Were we to view the village at this time, we would be able to identify Wilson's store, Monica's Meat Market, built by a man from Sturgeon Bay around 1865, and Theodore Baraboo's hardware store. In 1910, Egg Harbor had a winning ball team. The Concord Hotel was in full swing, and the schoolhouse was still located on G prior to its being relocated across town on School Street. No cement or blacktop in 1913, a road crew headed by Tom Carmody, road builder and contractor, was the route to go. Tom had married a Baraboo, owned his own sawmill, and was mimicked because of his stuttering. He was jokingly called Bye God. About this time, the Union Church was formed. It was built on property donated by Mrs. Anna Manny. Known as the Stone Church and then the Evangelical Church, it was used until 1967 when the present Community United Methodist Church replaced the original building. Across the road was a stone bluff with excellent building stone. Called the Stone Steps, the quarry provided the stone exterior for the Union Church. In the village center, across the road from Doc Ames' home and office, where incidentally you could purchase, in addition to Doc's drugs, such items as candy, wallpaper, and china — Doc was quite an entrepreneur — stood the Kewanee House. It was so named because it was built by John Warchuk from Kewanee. He was followed by Ed Fiedler, who in turn sold it to John Bertschinger. In 1912, it was bought by John and Phoebe Carmody, relative to the Thomas, called Black Jack, and William, called Red Jack, Carmodys, who settled south of Egg Harbor in 1857, having originally arrived from Limerick, Ireland. Other past owners of the Kewanee House, later named the Harbor Inn, include Art and Olive Parent, son of Peter Parent, who farmed on top of the bluff above the golf course, Murphy Moore, John Pershulsky, Don and Angel Davis, and others. The dining room was added as a lean-to after the original saloon was built. Under John Bertschinger's ownership, the lean-to was torn down and a hotel was added. A room in those days was 25 cents and a meal was 25 cents. Whiskey was delivered by the barrel and sold for 5 cents a glass. I am told they played baseball behind the tavern. In the 20s and early 30s, there was a stable and ice house behind the hotel. Since the original road through town was but a dirt trail, when we did receive crushed stone and it was rolled, it was quite the thing. Don't know if it's true or not, but I was told old Bill Fisher who had a home across from the Concord Hotel, would put water on the dirt road in front of his place before it was graveled. Apparently it made a mud hole, and when the automobiles tried to go through the mud, they would get stuck. Then Bill would pull them out, for a fee, of course. Before the lumberyard and feed mill were built, there was a stable located between Baraboo Stone House and Doc Ames's house. Most people had to rely on a horse and buggy, or sleigh, for transportation. The owner of a wire-spoke buggy was something special. There was a barn behind LaRouche's grocery store, which was probably used for a stable. By 1914, many new names were added to the list of residents and businesses. To name a few, in addition to those already mentioned, Joe Eichinger Store and Cheese Factory, O.B. Ginter, shoe repair, C.W. Guard, postmaster, Art Matthews, hotel, saloon, and barber shop, William Schultz, blacksmith shop, and others. According to his daughter, Esther Warchek Bernstein, Joe Warchek married a Bruning girl in 1887, having been married by Judge Lyman. He started out as a blacksmith and wagon maker in the building which is still standing across the road from Old Stage Station. Esther said her mother told her that Indians who lived on top of the hill on the east side of Division Road would come into town for milk and beg her mother for some of that good medicine, meaning whiskey. Her mother would tell them that they did not have any, so that they would go away. Joe Warchek had a fanning mill, and then a meat market, and then a feed and flour store. He made ice and had a slide on the side of the store. Cider vinegar was sold from a barrel. The truck was used for a grocery route around the county. The Kewanee House, like all buildings, was upgraded as times changed. Do bear in mind that Egg Harbor did not have electricity until about 1924, so things were quite primitive during this period. All the old-timers remembered the Bon Ami and the Thistle, boats of the Heartline, when they would pull into Ames's dock. The Thorpe dock was washed out by this time, and the Ames dock took its place. On the pier was an elevator feed mill, where also was stored peas, grain, and potatoes. Time will change things. As we look back, Wilson's store is gone. Max Wilson's Creamery, which had become Otto Wolf's Meat Market, and then Harry and later Les Olson's General Store, burned to the ground about 1932. And Egg Harbor's first schoolhouse, where Henry Meyer, the blacksmith that took over from Joe Warchek, lived, after it was no longer used as a school, torn down. At this point, Myers moved into the Sylvester DeFair House, still standing on the east side of 42, just south of County E, currently a gift shop. When John Bertschinger came to Egg Harbor in 1904, one of his first ventures was to build a dock for shipping. He catered to the supply boats, whereas the Ames dock was more a passenger pier. Charles Cady had built a large boat house on someone else's property, just south of the Ames dock, but they made him tear it down. John's first try at cargo hauling was aboard the Minnie R. Many of the earlier residents were involved in shipping, since the waters of Green Bay provided a natural transportation system. Sturgeon fishing would soon be no more. As John progressed, the boats got bigger. The Culbert, piloted at times by Harvey Ostrand Sr. from Sturgeon Bay, could carry 60 ton. At this time, he was in the lumber and feed business, so the Culbert carried building materials, cement, grain, potatoes, and produce, often between Menominee and Egg Harbor. The Carpenter Cook Company in Menominee was the source of much of the supplies. In winter, supplies were teamed across the ice. During the summer months, the piers were a beehive of activity. In addition to local boats, we were seeing the larger boats from the Goodrich line, namely the Georgia and the Carolina. The Bon Ami continued to use Egg Harbor as a port of call. The building on the road down to the dock was first a cooper shop, and then later became an ice house. Winter meant horses and sleighs. After Jim Wilson was killed on the way to Sturgeon Bay by a trailer loaded with apples, which had unhooked from a car and crashed into his vehicle, the store was taken over by Milton Wolfe. We have been talking most recently of the village. Let's get back to Horseshoe Bay for a while. A gentleman by the name of Mallory had a cottage on Horseshoe Bay, and after dying at the Harbor Inn and E.N., nicknamed Brick, Murphy, bought the cottage. I can only assume he fell in love with the area because he then built a huge farm and orchard complex known as Horseshoe Bay Farms. He was soon joined by his brother Frank. These two gentlemen then helped form the United Fruit Growers Company. In 1916, the brochure showed the land being cleared. The property involved was located on top of the Horseshoe Bay Hill. John Buechner was one of the workmen in the party. John was also an excellent stonemason. Although the original road connecting the village to Horseshoe Bay was located just below the bluff, the county redid the road, making it a macadam road in the location that we know it today. The Murphys were descendants of Simon Murphy, the Irish immigrant who made his money in the logging and lumbering business. It was then natural that Frank Murphy would build a beautiful summer home, presently owned by the Coles family. The Coles are descendants of Simon Murphy as well. Simultaneously, the Horseshoe Bay Country Club was formed. It was hoped to solicit Green Bay families into the organization. Cherry Lodge was initially part of the resort complex. When the country club failed to materialize, this building was used as a summer home for friends. Although rustic by today's standards, their units were premium accommodations in their day. Later, many of the cottages were moved off the property, being purchased and used as private summer homes. Unfortunately, after the main clubhouse was built, it was never used for the purpose for which it was intended. It was an impressive building as it was, and after seeing the blueprints of the final version, and had it been completed as the architect had planned, it would have been one of the finest buildings in Door County. As it turned out, it was used as a cherry pickers camp before it was razed in the 1960s. At this point in time, the Harbor Inn had taken on a new look. No longer the Kiwani House, it was truly a hotel. Remember that other than the Concord Hotel, there were no other places to stay, winter or summer. The porch along the side of the building apparently was a gathering place in nice weather. This would be about 1918. Because she was a large vessel, being able to handle some rather severe weather, the Bon Ami continued to service Egg Harbor. Since the Goodrich Boat Line was making stops in Sturgeon Bay much more frequently than at Egg Harbor, and because Door County did have the Anape Western passenger train line about this time, the only way to get north from Sturgeon Bay was first the stage and then the Yellow Cab Company. The cab was owned by Frank Anderson of Ephraim, brother to Adolph, who owned the Anderson Dock, and J.C. Dana, who owned the Buick Garage. The bus was an elongated Buick. At one point, Mark Broman drove the cab, as did Clyde Helgeson and others. It was in operation about 10 years. Alongside LaRouche's store stood their garage. Adjacent was a tavern. It was built by John Michalczak about 1878. Early in its history, there was a John Deere implement sales room in part of the building. That part later became a dance hall. After Michalczak got out, it was operated by Jerry Lemire. Around 1924, August, Casey Laudenbach owned it briefly before being purchased by A.J. Del Leroy, who installed his son Miles in the tavern. It was called Forest Shade Gardens. A lot of Prohibition stories have been told, like how the bridge tender would call one of the saloons when the state men would enter the county, and then that tavern keeper would call the next one down the line, and so on. Or serve ice cream until the pressure was off. And the one about hiding the whiskey keg in the manure pile and forgetting it until spring. A blacksmith shop was built on the property to the east, serving many blacksmiths, the last of which was Cooney Schneider. John Peterson was around if you needed to borrow money. During the winter months, the horse-drawn stage continued to operate. What with the small shed on the sleigh with the stove inside and two small holes for the reins to pass through, it was very comfortable, most of the time. The Concord Hotel served as a stage station, with a barn and back for a fresh team. Walter Olson, who later became sheriff, was the driver. Albert Baraboo took care of the horses. Across from the grocery store and Forest Shade Gardens stood the Bruning farm. Both the horse barn and the cow barn were still standing in 1940. Leola Fountain used it in later years for his team. The Leroy and LaRouche children grew up during this era. An almost tragic accident took place about this time. Esther Warchek was driving down the hill to the dock in her father's Model T. Her brother Elmer was alongside her, and Eli Forrest was standing in the back. They think a nail, which was used to replace a pin, sheared in the steerage linkage, and they lost control of their vehicle. They narrowly missed Philip Lemire's pile driver, ending up in his fish boat. They also just missed Leonard Kill's cargo boat. Eli had jumped off the back, and fortunately no one was seriously injured. Incidentally, Eli Forrest was a bachelor who worked for Joe Warchek. He lived in a log house just north of Jim Wilson's grocery store, now the Pence Gallery. He was beloved by the townspeople, especially the children. He was bearded and tiny. At his death, Rose Wilson and Annie Collum laid him out for burial in his log cabin. The George Kolacheskis were then running the Concord Hotel. Ellen Ressler was their hired girl. Summer resorts and motels in Egg Harbor were yet to be. The road connecting the village and Horseshoe Bay followed the shore as it left Egg Harbor. As we look down over the village from the site where the new schoolhouse was to be, the school being built in 1912 by Jerry and Philip Lemire, we get a bird's eye view of our little community. Alongside the Concord Hotel on the east side was erected a large hall. Not only did they hold dances in this hall, but the late Henry Gilson told me that as a young lad, he used to play basketball in this building. The shoreline looking down from the top of the bluff would depict the cargo dock and storage building owned by John Bertschinger. The McPherson House was one of the first summer homes built in Egg Harbor. The Ames Dock now became the Fruit Growers Cherry Dock. Simultaneously, the storage building on the John Bertschinger Pier was taken down. Although changes take place, memories linger on. The back door of the Harbor Inn served as the service entrance, exposing a small parking lot. One might see some of the locals of the day cavorting, like Herman Bernstein, Evelyn Parent Blank, Art Parent, who owned the Tavern Hotel at this time, Olive Parent, and probably some boarders. Back in the good old days might be a comment you would hear from Celia Roy when she looked back at her being 35 years of age. She and Miles ran the gardens and would have a good view of the village from their rooftop perch. After Doc Ames moved out of his downtown house and store, J.F. Bertschinger moved in. John had a paint store in what had been Doc's office. It later became a gift shop within the Stagecoach Junction complex. Although John Bertschinger had lived in Egg Harbor since 1904, his brother, Paul, did not get involved until 1911, when the two brothers purchased land from Ferdinand Holtz for a resort. Paul did vacation in Egg Harbor during this time, and along with his other brother Fred and friends, did what everyone else did, fished. The horse barn behind the lumber yard made a good backdrop for displaying the day's catch. When the Ginters moved out, the Paul Bertschinger family moved in. Mr. Ginter, who was a surveyor and brother to Mrs. John Bertschinger, moved to Port Washington, so this house became available for rent. Max Wilson's store was in full operation at the time. The house adjacent to the store was supposedly moved off the Ames property, having previously been occupied by Mrs. Ames's parents. When John Warchek owned the Kewanee house, he had a creamery and cheese factory in back. His brother, Joe, came to Egg Harbor initially to help his brother out. Across the street from the saloon lived Dave and Caroline Verts, parents of Lena Giesman Schultz, which later became known as Lena's Sip and Chat. The Cupola House by this time had taken on the character as we know it today. It was put on the National Historic Register by the Secretary of Interior on July 16, 1979, about the time the village board was contemplating purchasing the home as a village hall and preserving it for posterity. About this time, Fred Sauger and his wife were about these parts. Fred was a son of Ben. His mother had been a Bruning prior to her first husband's death, so he was related to the Warcheks. Fred was an excellent athlete, having first played baseball for Egg Harbor before playing for the University of Wisconsin at Madison. In 1921, 10 years after purchasing the property, the Bertschinger brothers began construction of Alpine. As they drove down the Bathing Beach Hill, past the Sterling property, the stone monument on the left identified what was to be the entrance to their resort. First came the main lodge. It was originally only a third the size you know it today. Many of the Brungravers helped with the construction, as did August Laudenbach, Carl Abrahamson, and many other available carpenters in the area at the time. Since Egg Harbor did not have electricity in 1921, the powerhouse was constructed to house a power plant for the resort. The flywheel of the engine that ran the DC generator was about 6 feet in diameter and weighed over 1,000 pounds. The gas engine was so noisy it was necessary to exhaust in the ground. So in 1922, as printed in the Advocate, a new resort opened at Egg Harbor. The grand opening was held June 18th and included a dinner, musical presentation, and dancing in the latter part of the evening. Things weren't as convenient in those days, attested to by the wood box for fueling the cook stoves. Some bills from the era are revealing. For example, sirloin butts, 25 cents, buy a Tuesday boat, Goodrich Line. Beef ribs, 30 cents per pound. We ask that you return the ice chest to Union Stockyards, Chicago, Illinois. Theodore Baraboo, galvanized pail, 30 cents. 6 dry cells, $2.40. Albert Kalmbach, coal, fuel, fish. Agent for the Hill Steamboat Line. Trout, 25 cents. W.C. Beringer Oil Company, gasoline, 21 cents. Gus Tank was still delivering mail. When he retired, he was followed by his son, John, who in turn was followed by Joseph Bub Lemire, father of Pete Lemire, who took over his dad's house across the road from the community center. How did our village look in 1926? Well, actually, Egg Harbor really hadn't changed that much. The filling gas station north of the Wilson store still had not come into being. Were we to glance down the street to the southeast, the village would show most of the buildings we see today, less, of course, the Baraboo House. The road through town was fairly wide and made an excellent field to play baseball. The local team would actually practice in the road, that is, when it wasn't muddy from the rain. A board sidewalk connected the Warchek store and the LaRouche store. The last addition to the Concord Hotel and Dance Hall was the Palm Garden. It was situated between the road and the hall. I remember as a youngster having been in the hall to see a medicine show. On one occasion, they borrowed the Warchek organ for a performance. Herman Bernstein by this time was courting the Warchek girl, Esther. In 1925, Herman opened the Point Beach station. It was built on the same site as the Standard Station, currently owned by the Miller brothers. He originally had set up a shop in his brother Charlie's garage across the street with the tire business, currently a gift shop. But things did not work out, and this new facility was the result. In 1931, he built the present stone building as we know it today. Since Egg Harbor did not have electricity when he first built, Herman installed a Delco plant providing power for himself, the Concord Hotel, and a Warchek store. Charlie Bernstein sold his garage to Otto Conrad. In 1926, the first 9 holes of the present golf course were constructed. The developers who subdivided Point Beach sold off the property on the south side of County G to Orrin Glidden, the same person who inspired Glidden Lodge. Mr. Glidden hired Ed Cabot and a crew of men to construct a golf course on land which was first owned by James Turner. Was the home of Russell Baker, whose house still stood behind the large maple tree by the golf course, was farmed by William Rittenberg around 1857, and was last farmed by Jerry Shields. At a later White Beach real estate office was moved across the road and became the Pro Shop. By now, the hill to the beach was being improved, what with the additional traffic the resort business was creating. A bathhouse was provided for the bathers. Just east of the beach had been the Kirkland Dock. Remnants of old cribbing still remain underwater. On shore had been located a sawmill. In 1927, Alpine tripled the size of the main lodge. Horses and scuppers were used to move ground. Like Doc Ames said, he always knew that Egg Harbor would be the biggest and best vacation village in the country. Shortly after Orrin Glidden built the golf course, the Depression hit. Mr. Glidden asked the Bertschinger brothers to buy the course, which they did. By this time, Orrin's holdings were collapsing, and the money he received from the sale of the golf course merely went to pay Mr. Glidden's debts. It broke his heart, and within 6 months he died. To provide water for the course, a pump house was built on the shore across the road from the clubhouse. It was later torn down to make room for Herman Bernshine's new home. Captain Bill Levine and his wife Mary had a home behind what is now the White Cliff condominium. Bill was a fisherman and, I'm told, fairly handy with the bottle. Strangely, the deed for the property was only in Mary's name. Ever see a red 1930 Chevrolet Sports Roadster? Herman Bernstein had sold one, and when the new owner died unexpectedly, Herman ended up with the car. His mechanic, Wally Leimbach, who worked at the Standard Station many years, helped enjoy the auto. The rumble seat must have been fun. At this point in time, Eli Forrest's log cabin was still standing, though deserted. In 1930, the concrete highway from Sturgeon Bay to Egg Harbor was completed. Sure gave the village a nice look. The Point Beach garage was selling Chevrolets, Lee Adams being the mechanic. By now, the lumber yard was a big business. In addition to building supplies, a feed mill graced the property. All winter long, the farmers would come to town with their teams to have their feed ground. Must have been a cold ride in from the countryside, because they usually went across the street to Parents Harbor Inn for something. You would have to be an old-timer to remember the sanitary market. By this time, Les Olson had succeeded Leo LaRouche, and Marvin Trudell was soon to follow. We were very fortunate to have John Knippel living in town during this period. Although a house painter, John was also an artist and did some beautiful murals, 3 of which are still preserved in Egg Harbor. In the Door County Advocate column, Traveling Back, we learn a few interesting tidbits of trivia. For example, October 28th, 1921. If you hear the sound of a bell, it was a present the ladies of the village gave to the school. April 17th, 1930. Excavating has begun on the large summer home for Dr. Hickey, who was the father of Mrs. Burnham. Columns Drugstore and Post Office was a very busy place. Also a variety store, it was the predecessor to Phoebe Carmody's, later known as Gilson's, across the street, currently a gift shop. Mail came to the post office daily, in winter requiring a team and sleigh. About this time, Anna Cabot Collum was widowed, so she married Albert Baraboo. They then moved into the stone house alongside the Concord Hotel, adding an annex to the building from where Anna ran a post office. Time-wise, the year would be about 1932. Eunice Cabot and Bill Bertschinger were assigned the job of displaying the big lawyer one of the local fishermen caught in their net. In 1933, the Paul Bertschinger family moved into their new home across from the Cupola House. Next door to Paul's house, Gus Groff ran the tavern originally owned by Jerry Lemire. In back of the tavern stood the ice house. If you are old enough, and both Gladys and Bill Bertschinger are, you will recall that Casey's, August Laudenbach purchased the tavern from Gus Groff in 1937, had a summer kitchen attached to the back of their building. This kitchen was later moved to the edge of the bluff between the tavern and Philip Lemire's fish house, which stood behind Philip's house. The summer kitchen was remodeled by Merle Schneider and was his summer home for many years before he built his place below on the shore. Certainly Hoyt Vroman will remember the sailboat Scout on which he and Harold Wolf entertained all the young ladies. The open fishing boat, American Patrol, was piloted by Jeff and Laverne Lemire and brought in many a catch of black bass and perch. I have previously said that Mother Nature can be very cruel. Imagine the heartache when, after spending the winter making concrete logs and then assembling them into a concrete log crib for a pier, the ice came along the same night the project was completed and twisted the dock into a grotesque shape. It was necessary at this point to bring in a marine dredge and scoop into a barge what had been the efforts of a crew of men for the past 2 months. The Tyrol, used as a passenger excursion boat and as a fishing boat, plied these waters every summer. Once again, all good things must come to an end. On a warm summer day, preparing to return to the harbor after a day of fishing, Art Bertschinger, as skipper of the Tyrol, prepared to start the engine. Apparently, gas fumes from the engine were ignited by a spark from the starter, and the boat blew up. Orrin Lemire, who was pulling in the anchor, was blown about 25 feet off the bow. Fortunately, no one was seriously hurt, and all the parties aboard were rescued. Hard to believe, but the beach at one time had sand all the way along the shore to Burnham's Pier. You people with your chainsaws don't know what wood cutting is all about. In 1934, had you asked Lloyd Schneider and Ed Cabot about a crosscut saw, they probably would have given you an opportunity to try your hand. In 1937, misfortune struck again, this time in the burning down of the Palm Garden and Dance Hall. John Schleiss owned the hall at the time, and Patty Gray and his wife Ella owned the tavern. Gertie and Max Nauman had just celebrated their wedding there. Because the heat was so intense, they covered the roof across the street with wet blankets so the shingles would not catch on fire. Egg Harbor had a miniature golf course about this time. Miles Leroy built it between his tavern and the grocery store, and their daughter Marvel helped run it. If you recall Andrew Anderson being one of the first settlers at Horseshoe Bay, then you would be aware of his son Art and his wife Cora, who was in the real estate business in Sturgeon Bay for so many years. Art retired to Horseshoe prior to his death. Located in the square was the Clover Farm store, which Milton Wolfe ran after the Wilsons moved out, to be followed by the Heberleys, then a gift shop, finally being torn down to become Harborview Park. And if you think the July 4th parade in the village is something new, it was in full swing back in 1938. Some of the folks put a lot of time in on their floats. How about taking a plane ride over the village in 1942? Probably the greatest change would have been the village dock property. In 1945, the Ames Orchard was really humming. Doc had passed on, and his son Spencer was in charge of the farm. Sylvester Thiel Sr. was both herdsman and orchard boss. So it's 1945 and the war is over. Most of the young lads who went to war from our area came back. Unfortunately and sadly, some did not. Big 85-foot air rescue boats were being bought up by yachtsmen and converted into pleasure craft. Theodore Barbeau had died by this time. Murphy Moore had taken over the Forest Shade Gardens. So Francis Bogenschutz and Miles Leroy, his brother-in-law, went into the hardware business. They in turn were followed by Gordy Nelson from Bailey's Harbor. And most recently, the store has been turned into an antique shop. Then other shops. Initially, the hardware store had an annex on the south side of the building, which housed a pipe storage area. Later, this annex was torn down, and the house on the north side of the building was so badly burned in a fire that it had to be dismantled. During the Second World War, Roy Oshkosh, a Potawatomi Indian chief, worked in the shipyard in Sturgeon Bay. He married his first wife, Ruth, and built a home and then a trading post at the foot of the Egg Harbor Hill. While Chief Oshkosh was still alive, Dr. Coles from Horseshoe Bay had a statue carved of Roy. The carving was done by Ernest Dumbrow from a solid piece of pine. It was erected at the foot of the Horseshoe Bay Hill. Sadly, someone stole the statue and it has never been found. After Ruth died, Roy married his second wife, Agnes, and then continued to run the trading post after Chief's demise. The second nine on the golf course was built in 1948 on property that had once been the Doty farm, years prior. Old man Doty used to drive into town with his oxen and had the reputation as being quite a character, and according to Al Cabot, had quite the two daughters. You may find this interesting. In 1950, the Baltimore Colts football team stayed at Alpine for a week in fall, right after Labor Day. They used the fairway on the 7th hole, red 9, for a practice area. Gone forever is the Driftwood Motel. Built by John Nelson on an empty field, it was torn down to make way for the White Cliff condominiums. In 1963, ground was broken for the new community church on the north end of Egg Harbor. Merlin Gehring was pastor at the time and very instrumental in accomplishing this monumental feat. It was built by the members themselves and friends. From the raising of the trusses to the dedication, it was a labor of love. In 1964, the village was incorporated. Harvey Hayne was the first president. Gordon Evans and Bill Bertschinger were the first trustees. Henry Gilson was clerk. Rose Olson was treasurer. Murphy Moore was elected assessor. Frank Leroy was county supervisor. Francis Bogenschut was constable. And Stephen Follett was our justice of the peace. So as the sun sinks slowly in the west, let's mention a few names so they will not be forgotten. Like the Gust Abrahamson family that lived across the road from the Union Church. The Bill Manny House located across from County E. John Tank, who built the home where Roger Paschke now lives. Jack and Clara Lemire Anderson, who lived opposite of John Tank. John Hultug, who built homemade skis, residing in the house later occupied by Nels Hankenet. Martin Megenberg, who married Philip Lemire's daughter, Celestia. Oliver and Diamond Lil Williams, the slot machine king who lived in the Truman Thorpe house for several years. Oscar Coleman, the butcher, whose shop was in the building operated as the Apple Pie Bakery, currently Sweet Basil. John Giesman, who bought Tom Comedy's Tavern. Doc and Lydia Schmidt, pioneers in the motel business. The Ericksons from Horseshoe Bay. The Jacobsons, the Arthur Bunda family, the Martins, who came to Egg Harbor in 1884, the Kriegers, here since 1881, the Odbert name, the Bidorf, the Joneses, the Wolfs, and the predecessor in Gene Ullman's log house, like Leimbach, Proust, and Paul Zane. Kenny Herbst, more recent perhaps, but a friend of many of us. And these are but a few. For those of us who still trod this ground, we can be very proud of our community. We have a heritage and a legacy. I'm certain if the walls could talk, at least those that are still standing, a lot of fun was had along the way. I'm certain also that a lot of hard work went into the making of our village. As I look around, I think our forefathers did a darn good job in shaping our community. So that's our legacy, to preserve Egg Harbor, to enjoy Egg Harbor, to all work together in the year ahead so that this village will continue to be, as Doc Ames so aptly said, the best vacation community in Wisconsin. Thank you.